It was supposed to be a simple snowshoeing trip. Just me, my dog, and the quiet crunch of snow underfoot. I'd checked the map before heading out. A 10-mile loop through the woods, nothing too strenuous. But winter has a way of changing things. The snow started falling heavier than forecasted, and the trail markers became harder to spot. My dog, Max, trotted ahead, his breath puffing out in little clouds. He seemed fine, but I was starting to feel the cold seep through my layers. That's when I saw it. A cabin. It wasn't much to look at, just a small, weathered structure with a slanted roof and a chimney puffing out thin wisps of smoke. The odd part was, I didn't remember seeing it on the map. I pulled out my phone to double check, but the screen was blank. No signal, no GPS, nothing. Max barked, his tail wagging as he bounded toward the cabin. I hesitated. Something about the place felt off. The windows were dark, and the smoke from the chimney didn't smell like wood. It was sharper, almost chemical. But the wind was picking up, and the temperature was dropping fast. I didn't have much of a choice. I knocked on the door. No answer. I tried the handle, and it creaked open. The inside was sparse. A single chair by the fireplace, a table with an old oil lamp, and a bed tucked into the corner. The air was stale, like no one had been there for years. But the fire in the hearth was still burning. Max whined, his ears flattening as he sniffed the air. I tried to calm him, but I was starting to feel it too. A prickling sensation at the back of my neck, like we weren't alone. I checked the corners of the room, but there was no one there, just the fire, crackling softly. I decided to wait out the storm. I sat in the chair, staring at the flames, trying to shake the unease. That's when I noticed the photos. They were tucked into the frame of the mirror above the fireplace. Old, faded pictures of people I didn't recognize. Except for one. It was me. I froze. The photo was recent, taken from a distance. I was standing in my backyard, shoveling snow. My heart started pounding. I grabbed the photo and turned it over. On the back, in shaky handwriting, it said, "You shouldn't have come here." Max barked again, louder this time. I turned to see him staring at the door, his hackles raised. The wind howled outside and the fire flickered, casting long shadows on the walls. That's when I heard it. A faint knocking, coming from the bedroom. I didn't stay to find out what it was. I grabbed Max and bolted out the door, not bothering to close it behind me. The snow was coming down harder now, and the cabin disappeared into the whiteout within seconds. I didn't stop running until I reached the trailhead. When I got home, I checked the map again. The cabin wasn't there. I even asked a few locals, but no one knew what I was talking about. To this day, I can't explain what happened. But sometimes, when I'm shoveling snow in my backyard, I catch myself glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone watching me. What do you think really happened? Let me know in the comments below. Every year, our town holds a winter festival. It's the kind of event that brings everyone together. Hot cocoa, twinkling lights, and a giant ice sculpture in the town square. But this year, something felt off from the moment I arrived. The first thing I noticed was the decorations. They were the same as always, strings of lights, wreaths on every lamppost, but they looked older, faded, like they'd been sitting in an attic for decades. Even the music playing over the speakers sounded distorted, as if the recordings were warped. I shrugged it off, chalking it up to the town's budget cuts. But as I wandered through the festival, the unease grew. The vendors were all there, selling their usual trinkets and treats, but they didn't seem to notice me. They just stood there, staring blankly ahead, their smiles frozen in place. I tried to strike up a conversation with the woman running the hot cocoa stand. She handed me a cup without a word, her eyes fixed on something in the distance. When I took a sip, the cocoa was cold. The ice sculpture in the center of the square was different too. Instead of the usual reindeer or snowflake, it was a figure, a person, their arms outstretched as if reaching for something. The details were unnervingly lifelike, down to the expression on their face. It looked like they were screaming. I turned to ask someone about it, but the crowd had shifted. Everyone was facing the sculpture now, their heads tilted at the same angle. No one was talking. No one was moving. It was like they were waiting for something. That's when I noticed the snow. It was falling in slow motion, each flake hovering in the air for a moment before drifting to the ground. I reached out to catch one, but it dissolved before it touched my skin. I decided to leave. As I walked back to my car, I glanced over my shoulder. The crowd was still there, motionless, their eyes fixed on the sculpture. The music had stopped, and the only sound was the crunch of my boots in the snow. When I got home, I checked the town's website for information about the festival. There was nothing. No schedule, no photos, no mention of it at all. I called a friend to ask if they'd gone, but they didn't answer. In fact, no one answered. The next morning, I drove past the town square. The festival was gone, as if it had never happened. But the ice sculpture was still there, slowly melting in the sun. To this day, I still wasn't able to figure out what happened. What would you do in this situation? Let me know in the comments below. It was supposed to be a quick day hike, just me and my friend Sarah, enjoying the crisp winter air and the quiet beauty of the mountains. We'd done this trail a dozen times before, and it was always straightforward. A 5-mile loop through the woods with a scenic overlook at the halfway point. But this time, something was different. The first sign that things were off was the trailhead. The signpost was there, but the map was missing, leaving just an empty frame. Sarah joked that someone must have stolen it for firewood, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was a bad omen. The trail itself was familiar at first. The snow was fresh, untouched except for the occasional animal track. The trees were heavy with frost, their branches forming a canopy that filtered the pale winter sunlight. It was peaceful, almost magical. But about a mile in, I started noticing little things. The landmarks we usually relied on, the bent pine tree, the boulder shaped like a loaf of bread, were gone. In their place were trees and rocks I didn't recognize. Sarah didn't seem to notice, so I didn't say anything. Maybe I was just imagining it. Then the trail started to narrow. The snow got deeper, and the trees seemed to close in around us. The air felt heavier too, like the forest was holding its breath. Sarah finally spoke up. "This doesn't look right," she said, stopping to catch her breath. "Shouldn't we have reached the overlook by now?" I checked my phone, but there was no signal. My GPS showed our location as a blank gray area, as if we were off the map entirely. I tried to stay calm. "Maybe we took a wrong turn," I said, though I knew we hadn't. We kept walking, hoping the trail would loop back around. But the further we went, the stranger things became. The snow started falling harder, and the wind picked up, howling through the trees. The temperature dropped so quickly that my fingers went numb, even through my gloves. That's when we saw the footprints. They were fresh, leading off the trail and into the woods. Sarah wanted to follow them, thinking they might belong to another hiker who could help us. I hesitated, but we didn't have many options. The footprints led us to a clearing. In the center was a small cabin, its windows dark, and its roof sagging under the weight of the snow. It looked abandoned, but the door was slightly ajar. Sarah called out, but there was no answer. We stepped inside, hoping to find shelter from the storm. The interior was sparse, just a table, a chair, and a fireplace filled with cold ashes. But what caught my eye was the map on the wall. It was hand-drawn, with our trail marked in red, except the trail didn't loop. It ended here, at the cabin, with a single word scrawled beneath it: "Stay." Sarah laughed nervously. "Someone's idea of a joke," she said. Tell she was as unsettled as I was. We decided to wait out the storm. I tried to light a fire, but the wood was damp, and the matches kept going out. Sarah sat at the table, staring at the map. "Do you hear that?" she asked suddenly. I listened. At first, there was nothing but the wind. Then I heard it, a faint tapping, like someone knocking on glass. It was coming from the window. I turned to look, but there was nothing there. Just the snow, falling steadily outside. The tapping grew louder, more insistent. Sarah stood up, her face pale. "We need to leave," she said. We grabbed our gear and stepped outside. The storm had gotten worse, the snow coming down in thick, blinding sheets. The footprints we'd followed were gone, covered by fresh snow. We tried to retrace our steps, but the trail was nowhere to be found. That's when we saw the figure. It was standing at the edge of the clearing, just barely visible through the snow. It was too far away to make out any details, but I could tell it was watching us. Sarah called out, but the figure didn't move. We started walking in the opposite direction, hoping to put as much distance between us and the cabin as possible. But no matter which way we went, we always ended up back at the clearing. The figure was always there, standing in the same spot, watching. By nightfall, we were exhausted. The temperature had plummeted, and the storm showed no signs of letting up. We had no choice but to return to the cabin. The fire was lit when we walked in, though neither of us had touched it. The map was still on the wall, but the word beneath the trail had changed. It now read, "Welcome." We spent the night huddled by the fire, too scared to sleep. The tapping continued, growing louder and more frantic as the hours passed. At one point, I thought I heard a voice, whispering something I couldn't quite make out. When morning came, the storm had finally stopped. The figure was gone, and the trail was visible again. We followed it back to the trailhead, not speaking the entire way. We never talked about what happened after that. Sarah moved to another state a few months later, and I haven't been hiking since. But sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I hear that tapping again, and I wonder if the cabin is still out there, waiting for someone else to find it. Do you think the cabin was real? Tell me in the comments. It was the kind of snowstorm that makes you feel like the world has stopped. The roads were empty, the streets were silent, and the only sound was the wind howling against the windows. I was curled up on the couch with a book, trying to ignore the creeping sense of isolation, when I heard the knock. At first, I thought it was the wind, but then it came again. 3 sharp raps, deliberate and unmistakable. I hesitated, glancing at the clock. It was past midnight. Who would be out in this weather? I peered through the peephole. A man stood on my porch, his face obscured by the hood of his heavy coat. He was hunched against the cold, his breath fogging in the air. Something about him made my skin crawl, but I couldn't just leave him out there. I opened the door just enough to speak through the crack. "Can I help you?" He didn't look up. "I'm sorry to bother you," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "My car broke down a few miles back. I just need to use your phone." Something about his tone felt off, like he was reciting lines from a script. But the storm was raging, and I couldn't bring myself to turn him away. "All right," I said, stepping aside. "But make it quick." He shuffled inside, snow falling from his coat and melting on the floor. I handed him my phone, keeping my distance as he dialed. He spoke quietly, his words muffled, and I couldn't make out what he was saying. When he handed the phone back, I noticed something strange. His hands were perfectly dry, despite the snowstorm outside. And his coat, it didn't look wet at all. "Thank you," he said, still not meeting my eyes. "I'll be on my way now." I watched as he stepped back out into the storm, closing the door behind him. That's when I noticed it. There were no footprints in the snow. Not on the porch, not on the steps, not in the yard. It was as if he'd never been there at all. I locked the door and checked the windows, my heart pounding. The storm was still raging, but the street was empty. No car, no stranger, no sign of anyone. The next morning, I went outside to shovel the snow. The storm had left behind a thick blanket of white, untouched except for my own footprints. But as I reached the edge of the yard, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A single set of footprints, leading away from my house. They started in the middle of the yard, as if someone had appeared out of thin air, and disappeared into the trees. I followed them, my boots crunching in the snow. The footprints were perfectly formed, as if they'd been made by someone walking calmly and deliberately, but they didn't lead to the road or any nearby houses. Instead, they veered off into the woods, where the trees grew thick and the snow was undisturbed. I hesitated at the edge of the forest. The trees loomed overhead, their branches heavy with snow. The footprints continued, winding deeper into the woods. I told myself to turn back, but curiosity got the better of me. The further I went, the quieter it became. The wind died down, and the only sound was the crunch of snow under my boots. The footprints never wavered, never stopped. They just kept going, as if they were leading me somewhere. That's when I saw it. A clearing. In the center of the clearing was a single, snow-covered bench. It looked old, the wood warped and cracked with age. The footprints led right up to it, and then stopped. There were no tracks leading away, no sign of where the stranger had gone. I stood there for a moment, staring at the bench. The air felt heavier here, like the forest was holding its breath. I called out, my voice echoing through the trees. There was no answer. That's when I noticed the snow on the bench. It was perfectly smooth, untouched, except for a single indentation, as if someone had been sitting there moments ago. I didn't stay to find out. I turned and ran, following my own footprints back to the house. When I got home, I locked the door and checked the windows, half expecting to see the stranger standing outside. But the yard was empty. The footprints were gone, covered by fresh snow. I haven't seen the stranger since that night, but I still think about him. Sometimes, when the wind howls just right, I swear I hear that knock again. And sometimes, when I look out the window, I see the bench at the edge of the woods, waiting. What do you think was really going on with that bench in the woods? Was it a trap, a warning, or something else entirely? Let me know your theories in the comments below. I'd love to hear what you think. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss a new tale. Until next time, stay curious and stay safe.